The significance of Anzac Day to we Australians. It must seem odd to a visitor to our country as to why a nation that is so aggressive in seeking success, particularly in the sporting world, has a very special national holiday to commemorate a military defeat, while all other nations celebrate only their victories. The reason is significant. In 1914, Australia was only in its 13th year as a nation, and its people had not at that early stage developed a meaningful national outlook. Vestiges of their colonial background were still prominent. Nevertheless, they aspired to a national identity, and the outbreak of war in 1914 provided it. Recruiting for an army began, not just a colonial regiment as in the past, but one that represented the nation as a whole, the Australian Imperial Force, the first AIF. And it didn't matter whether the recruits came from Proserpine or Perth, Mackay or Melbourne. They all wore the same uniform, with the same Rising Sun badge on their hats and collars and the same word Australia on their shoulders. And as these young soldiers boarded the troop ships taking them overseas to war, the Australian population realised that this was an Australian team, and they got behind it, the start of a national identity. Anticipation arose when it was learnt that these troops were to join with New Zealand in the Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, Anzac, in a major operation. They knew that their boys would do well, but how well and under what conditions, they were still to find out. This major operation was a plan to attack Germany from the east through its ally Turkey, and was a flawed plan, the brainchild of Britain's First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. The whole concept was complex, badly planned, using inadequate maps which did not represent the true nature of the ground, and the entire operation was doomed from the very start. The Anzac commitment to land on a Gallipoli beach with a flat hinterland without defensive fire positions for the Turks, and through which the Anzacs could exploit, having established a beachhead, was completely nullified when the Royal Navy landed them on the wrong beach, one which the Turkish army had dug itself into secure defensive positions on the overhanging cliffs. And as the luckless Anzacs were rowed ashore in their slow wooden boats, they were subjected to artillery, mortar, machine gun and rifle fire, as well from the well-sighted Turks. The casualties were appalling, as were those on the beach. One of the tragic mistakes of the planning generals was to underestimate the Turkish army. They had failed to appreciate the ferocity with which the Turks would defend their homeland, nor to recognise the tactical ability and inspirational leadership of their charismatic commander, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. But the Anzacs did achieve the almost impossible. They did establish a beachhead under horrendous conditions and with horrifying casualties. And for the next 8.5 months, until it was realised what a waste of human endeavour and life this campaign was, the Anzacs suffered under ghastly conditions, living in trenches, under continuous bombardment from Turkish artillery, subjected to regular infantry attacks, and combating the disease and sickness that these conditions cause. That old English schoolboy saying, "It matters not whether won or lost, but how we played the game," came into the fore here. The battle was lost before it began, but it was how the Anzacs played the game that was significant to this young nation. They played it with outstanding courage, determination, humour in the most dire situations, and most of all as a team, each member supporting each other, each one caring for his comrade in arms, his mate, what we call mateship. And in so doing, they created a culture for Australians to follow forevermore, and which we must remember as we remember those who created it. A culture which originated in the bush, where people new to this land, convicts and all, were carving out a living under strange conditions in an unforgiving country, and where survival often depended upon help from the nearest neighbour. This developed into the culture of mateship, and it was taken to Gallipoli and set in stone there. So the significance of this campaign, even though it was a military disaster, was it united the young Australia in grief for the dead and wounded, but in pride for the way the young people performed and the example they set. In fact, Gallipoli has often been referred to as the birth of our nation. Leaving over 8,000 dead on Gallipoli, the Anzacs went to join other Australian troops on the Western Front, one of whom was my father. In their first major operation on the Somme in July 1916, the Australians demonstrated that the spirit born in Gallipoli was dominant throughout the entire Australian forces. And throughout the remainder of the Western Front campaign, these qualities were used in excess by the British commanders under which they were serving, resulting in a far higher Australian casualty rate than any of its allies. In fact, disastrous as Gallipoli was, 85% of the Australian casualties in that war occurred on the Western Front. A total of nearly 60,000 dead and 3 times that number wounded. The 5 Australian divisions eventually became united as the Australia Corps under that great Australian commander, General Sir John Monash, and they showed their true form in many operations, culminating in the attacks of August 1918, which broke through the German lines and led to the armistice less than 3 months later. This day we remember our Australian Defence Force personnel, who over the years, sometimes at great sacrifice, have contributed greatly to the freedom we enjoy. A freedom we extend to less fortunate people from other countries and ethnic groups, inviting them to come and share our good fortune, practicing their various cultures without fear or hindrance. But in accepting these new cultures, we must not let our own innate culture, based on the Anzac tradition, be submerged. The well-known journalist Paul Kelly, in his book, The End of Certainty, wrote, "Australia was a constitutional entity with a spiritual void at its core. It longed for a test of national character. That came at Gallipoli, which in turn became a legend that was asked to do so much, to sustain a national identity." So Anzac Day is not a glorification of war. Its significance is to sustain that national identity and to remind us that we are one nation and that we are of that Anzac culture passed on to us by our Anzac forebears. A culture that is love of our neighbour and the Christian belief in the rights of people to their individual freedom and happiness. A culture of fortitude, initiative, humour in adversity, and a determination to do our best in spite of all difficulties. And most importantly, a culture of caring for and supporting our comrades through the hard times, what we call mateship. And that is the significance of Anzac Day to we Australians, lest we forget.